I've learned over time that for some odd reason, our forums tend to attract political junkies. So what more delicious way to end a conference such as this than by welcoming the voices that we read in the New York Times and Newsweek and listen to on PBS and other cable news networks, Jonathan Alter, Matt Bai, and Gwen Ifill, to discuss how the ideals represented by John F. Kennedy resonate in our politics today, how the challenges he faced are similar or different to those of our national leaders. Unfortunately, a death in the family has prevented Bob Herbert from being here with us. Please keep your written questions coming. Gwen is going to try to go to questions a little bit earlier and use as many of those questions as possible. So please join me now in welcoming Jonathan Alter, Matt Bai, and Gwen Ifill.
You see, if Gwen uses your questions, Gwen works less hard. But I have a few questions of my own that I thought of in advance, and then, in my high-tech moment, I wrote a few more notes on my cell phone based on what we heard earlier today. So we're going to be able to kind of wrap up a lot of the incredibly smart stuff we heard from our previous two panels, which were really quite amazing. I'm also, I managed to do it with two follically challenged men, so I would look better.
So gratuitous.
I'm getting them used to what's about to happen, because on Washington Week on Friday nights, I get to play with my panelists. It's my chance to have a little conversation, a dinner party that you can eavesdrop on. And that's what we're going to do here, picking up where the other two panels have left off. Our job is to bring this into the now. What we saw happen with so much with talking about John F. Kennedy's 50 years and the observances of the last month or so, is we spent a lot of time living in the 60s. And it has not escaped our notice that there are a lot of comparisons to be made to where we are today. And the presidency we're experiencing now, we have on the panel with me two guys who have written amazing books about the now and about the political moment we find ourselves in, as well as about political history. And so I want to start off with that by asking you guys to reflect a little bit about this, because we have seen Barack Obama compared to everybody. We have seen him compared to Reagan. We have seen him compared, not to Nixon so much, I suppose, but we've seen him compared to Lincoln, and we have certainly heard him compared to JFK.
And Marx, don't forget Marx.
And Marx. Well, you see now, I didn't say that. No. Matt, start with me. How valid are any of these comparisons based on what you've seen and how this White House has worked so far?
You know, I'm not a big fan. We are awash in historical analogies, as you point out. I'm not a big fan of using them with great facility, but I do think there's something to the comparison to President Kennedy and President Obama. It depends if you're talking about the person or the moment, right? Because they're different things. And I think if you look at the people, just in terms of the generational shift that each represents, which I think is very analogous, the sort of style, their personal style, the sort of elan and the coolness, and the use of sort of a wry sense of humor. If you watch President Kennedy at those early news conferences and think about the way President Obama communicates, I think there are legitimate similarities. There's differences, too, in who they are as people. I think President Kennedy was probably a lot more comfortable with the establishment power and the society that he grew up with. I think this president is much more decidedly an outsider in his inner makeup. But the moments, you know, the moments have some similarity, too. I was thinking about this on the plane ride. I was born in 1968, so the legend of the Kennedy...
I know, that's a shame, isn't it?
I saw a bunch of people out here for whom that's like ancient history. So, but the legend of the Kennedy presidency and its power was really handed down to my generation to sort of read about and try to understand. And you wonder why it is. I mean, I doubt very much that it's not simply the assassination, right? William McKinley was assassinated. I doubt very much in the Truman presidency anybody was talking this much about the McKinley presidency. And I think this is. I think there is something special about the Kennedy presidency, and part of it, I think, to relate it to now, is that was really the last time, in a sense, and I think Americans felt very earnest and very hopeful about their politics, because it's immediately followed by Vietnam and the rioting in the cities, ultimately by Watergate, energy crisis, the gas lines, the hostages. That in a sense, everything after, if you grew up, as I've grown up, everything after has been a decrying of our politics and a sense of something lost, and there's been a societal cynicism and disillusionment with institutional power that didn't exist really for the last time probably with John F. Kennedy. And so in that sense, President Obama, I think, came to office in a similar moment. When you saw that inauguration, and I was there, and when you felt around the country in the days, the weeks before the election, this kind of, particularly among younger Americans, this kind of extreme sense of hope and optimism, I think it was very different from the string of presidencies that came before, and probably was most analogous to President Kennedy's moment. I think partly the story of the last 2 years, which John has told so well, is really about grappling with the gap, the delta between that hope and the reality of governing at the modern moment.
Richard Reeves, John said that Lincoln never had to balance a budget. And that's not what, or he did, but nobody remembers that about him.
Right.
And yet that seems to be, that nuts and bolts seems to be what's consuming this president in some ways.
Well, I think in one of the earlier panels, we heard that most of the presidency of John F. Kennedy was reactive, and the same is true of Barack Obama. In fact, when he was first running for president in late 2006, and he was starting to have meetings before it was publicly known that he was running, they had a meeting with a group of people who were going to be on the inside of his campaign, and he said, as he often does, "Look, guys," that's his expression, 70% of this job is reactive, only about 30% is what we're going to initiate, and we just need to know that going in. And I think that he has learned that arguably the hard way. So he has been dealing maybe with not the same level of international crisis that JFK did, but with a much more severe domestic situation, with water coming over the side of the boat practically every day in 2009, and preventing another Great Depression, which is something that I think it's going to take a while before historians fully give Obama credit for that, but we were a lot closer to having a true depression. In fact, if we just kept going the way we were losing 750,000 jobs a month in January of 2009, and if we'd stayed on that pace, by November of 2009, we would have been in another Great Depression without a smidgen of exaggeration. But so things were really bad, and in that sense, I think the moments they might have been similar kind of psychically in terms of generational expectation, but they were very different in terms of the condition of the country, because we were not, even though JFK talked about let's get the country moving again, he was not faced with the same kinds of things domestically, and Obama hasn't been faced with the same kinds of things internationally. I agree with you that temperamentally they really have a lot in common, and it's that word cool.
Almost to the point where it seems as if both Barack and Michelle Obama have studied the Kennedys, and that it's not by accident that you see similarities.
Yeah, I don't think it's entirely by accident, and that, clearly Obama was born 3 years after I was born in 1957, 4 years after. And so we were born in, everything was Kennedy. I mean, you talk about us being follicularly challenged. Why is that a problem? Because Kennedy had hair and we don't, I mean,
so
it was all about...
I didn't even know it was a problem.
I mean, Eisenhower didn't have any, So everything was in the shadow of JFK. There was once a wonderful book, written by the great historian William Leuchtenberg, called In the Shadow of FDR, which, when I was writing a book about FDR, I became very impressed by. And we grew up, and Obama grew up, in the shadow of JFK. So anybody who went into politics, particularly if you were a Democrat, there was a cartoonist named Mark Stamety who had a running joke about the JFK look-alike caucus. All these politicians. And then you started getting Republicans who would try to look like JFK.
Dan Quayle would be a
great example.
Well, there's Scott Brown.
Scott Brown would be another example. So it was very much in that shadow. But then there were just other things that were more innate about Obama that are very similar. And I'm reminded of a line that Arthur Schlesinger had. He asked, he got this from Jackie and wrote it in 1,000 Days, that when JFK and Jackie were dating, and Jackie said to him, "So what are you?" And she meant that politically, like, you know, what makes you, what are you politically? And his answer was, "I'm an idealist without illusions." And I think that very much captures the way Barack Obama looks at himself.
Yeah, you talked about him being reactive, being forced to be reactive in these first 2 years of his presidency. I wonder if health care falls into that. That seemed to be an effort to be proactive, which became reactive because at the timing, because of other things on the plate. But if you know, so much of the commentary now is that was a fight he didn't need to pick.
Yeah, and I think it was his most proactive fight, and that's why. It was a
That's very un-Kennedy-esque in its way.
A fight of his choosing. Yeah, but I do think, you know, someone said on the last panel that it's easy to forget that President Kennedy was a genuine liberal with very strong liberal convictions, and that sets him aside essentially from, you know, what we think of as liberal today. And I'm not sure that I understand the point, but I would disagree slightly, because I think the moment is so different, and what liberalism means and the context in which we view it is so different. I mean, President Kennedy's time was a vastly smaller federal government with vastly less reach in the society, right? Where you know, there was, it was, I think, possible to be very liberal still and build toward a great liberal vision of government without having to take stock of the incredible sort of apparatus that liberalism built in government when we look at it today. And you know, I think if we were going to compare politically President Kennedy to where President Obama is, I think if he were governing today, given everything I've read and know about him, which is less than most of the historians in the room, I think he would be very much where President Obama is, and very much a more centrist kind of Democrat. I think this administration is turning out to be relatively centrist, and I think that's where President Kennedy would be, because I think given everything he said and stood for at the time, I think looking at the size and scope of the federal government, looking at the number of programs that are successful, but also some that have not been successful, looking at the budget problems that exist, I think he would be, as President Obama is, very wary of rushing headlong into a renewed liberal vision of government without taking stock, without looking back at what's been done and how it needs to be modernized or changed or scaled back. And so I think to separate, to look at a president's politics in view of one moment and then compare it to the other is very difficult to do.
You agree with that?
You know, yeah, I do. I mean, they're both very pragmatic centrists. The Republicans always like to point out that Kennedy cut taxes. What they don't mention is that his tax cut took the top marginal rate down to 70%. I think it had been, 90 or something before that. So, we were living in a very different country. Why did Obama do health care? This was one of the big questions that I tried to answer in the promise. And Rahm Emanuel told me I begged the president not to do this. Axelrod didn't want him to do it. Joe Biden didn't want him to do it because for the same reason that Kennedy's advisors didn't want him to move forward on civil rights right away. They thought that it would break his political popularity. So I asked the president, why did you do it? And he said, I knew I'd go down 10 to 15 points in the polls and that I might jeopardize re-election. So I repeated the question, so why'd you do it? And he said, because if we didn't do it now, it wouldn't have happened.
That was a different calculation than Kennedy made about civil rights.
Very different. With Kennedy, it was more, the country's not quite ready for this, so maybe we should do it a little bit later when we have the votes. With Obama, he was very conscious of the votes. That's why there was no public option, because the votes weren't there for it. But he knew they had to strike while the iron was hot. And so that was more of an FDR first 100 days, or LBJ in 1965, where they pushed through this great amount of legislation. And the health care bill, whatever one's complaints with it, is the most significant piece of domestic social legislation since Lyndon Johnson in 1965, completing the unfinished Kennedy agenda. This is something that I think people have completely lost sight of, is how big this bill is.
And you see it as a follow-on to what the groundwork that Kennedy laid.
Well, it starts really, there's a history that goes back to the Teddy Roosevelt platform of 1912, the Bull Moose platform, and then Roosevelt kind of wanted to make health care coverage part of Social Security, but he didn't have the votes for it. And there's a kind of a funny story that relates to the family of the wife of one of Roosevelt's sons, very prominent doctor from Boston. Babe Paley, who Sally wrote a book on, the Paleys. Her sister was married to Jimmy Roosevelt, and the Cushing sisters, very famous in Boston. Their father was the most famous doctor in America, and he convinced Roosevelt not to do health care in the 30s. Then in 1948, Truman tried and got slam dunked by the American Medical Association. Then Kennedy kind of edges up to it, realizes there aren't the votes, and Johnson's able to complete part of it with Medicare and Medicaid, and then the story is interrupted until the present day. And I think people's lack of satisfaction about the compromise, which you saw a lot of during the Kennedy administration. Liberals were very upset with Kennedy, and we haven't talked about that at all. He was not left enough for a lot of liberals, and they preferred Stevenson or Humphrey or somebody else who maybe was a little more liberal. Sound familiar? I mean, this is what presidents put up with if they're actually trying to move the ball forward, is they are going to get pressure from their base.
This parallel is really interesting, and I wrote about it a little bit at the time of the inauguration, that Norman Mailer does this very seminal piece of journalism in 1960. His first work of political journalism, right? Superman Comes to the Supermarket. And that then Senator Kennedy was an existential hero for the country. He was going to be the hipster president. This was a hugely influential piece of journalism, somewhat on politics, but really on journalism, because journalists try to emulate it, forever. It kind of spawns, in a sense, the Hunter Thompson school of journalism. But not 3 years later, right, Mailer publishes, having come completely around, publishes it's called the Presidential Papers, right, which includes a lot of his letters to President Kennedy. He's been writing these fervent letters in which he declares the whole thing to have been a mistake. He actually says he feels treacherous for having written Superman Comes to the Supermarket because he promoted the candidacy of a man who has no principle and pursues nothing but power. This has been in my mind a great deal as we've heard the very elevated and emotional language out of the left in Washington right now, which is so frustrated with this president, as I think there is a lot of similarity, and I think it is. I think President Obama would say, I feel comfortable he would say, as John is saying, and I think as President Kennedy felt, that to get these big things done, and healthcare is a really big thing, it's almost an endemic part of the exercise that you're going to lose the support of some of the most idealistic supporters you may have had, and that is the cost, to some extent, of progress.
It's easy to forget that at the root of all of this are two politicians that we're talking about here. They know how to count votes, and they know when to take the risks, and sometimes they don't, but in the end, that's what they're doing. Their calculations sometimes go awry. The calculations that Kennedy made were always able to depend in some part that he might get some Republican support, and that even if he lost some Democratic support, he could get some Republicans to go with him. That is no longer on the table. How different does that make the challenges that are facing Barack Obama than the challenges, just the nose vote counting challenges that faced Jack Kennedy? It seems that it's a whole different set of ideas, that the word bipartisanship is now a bad word in so many respects, and at least you stuck at the outset.
I mean, you had a solid Democratic South, and now you have a solid Republican South. So Kennedy could, he had trouble with the Southern racists, but some of them were, really smart, and he could work with them on other issues. You had people like Richard Russell and William Fulbright, who maybe he wouldn't get them on civil rights, but he could get them on other things. and he had more options because
Who
he
are
was
the Russells and Fulbrights now?
Well, it's just, I mean, it's a totally different situation because within his own party, Obama doesn't have that kind of trouble. Maybe you could call Joe Lieberman, a problem within his own party, but his problems with the other party. And in Kennedy's case, he could actually work with Everett Dirksen, who was the Senate Minority Leader from Illinois, who later, under Johnson, threw his support behind civil rights at a critical moment. But Kennedy could work with him sometimes on other issues. They also opposed them a lot, and we forget how toxic the political climate was with the right wing. Goldwater was already emerging. The John Birch Society was becoming very big in the early 60s. And when Kennedy went to Dallas, there was a lot of publicity about how Adlai Stevenson, in an earlier visit, had been attacked by right-wingers. There was a lot of right-wing stuff in the Texas press, and people were surprised that the assassin turned out to be from the left because had been so much right-wing opposition to Kennedy. So in that, I think there are some parallels. It has to be said that legislatively, Obama has had not just health care, but his record far exceeds Kennedy's legislatively. Now, there are just many, many more bills that have gone through in the first 2 years than did under Kennedy. But internationally, he hasn't saved the world in a Cuban Missile Crisis.
He won the Nobel Peace Prize.
He did win that, yeah, and he gave a good speech. Interestingly, on this, I just want to say one thing before I forget on the speeches, because there was a lot of talk in the earlier panel about the inaugural address. Kennedy's inaugural was much better than Obama's, and
Shorter.
It wasn't just shorter. It was better in many respects. And the only line that I think anybody can even remember from Obama's, 2 years later, is from Scripture. It's time to put
away
aside childish things. And the explanation for that, I think, is that the expectations for Obama were so high, and he realized that they were going to be brought to earth so quickly that he was trying to sober everybody up. That's what the childish things line was about. He didn't want to have a lot of high-flown, inspirational rhetoric. And you can see from the picture out there, the crowd's pretty small in 1961. It's about maybe 10,000 people there, next to 1 million, at the Obama inauguration. So.
You also didn't have the advantage of a 2-year run-up of a heavily television-covered campaign where people were moved to be there because of that.
Exactly. So he's dealing with all those expectations, and Obama, in some ways, intentionally does not want to ratchet them higher.
And yet Obama often seems to embrace the notion that it's good to be underestimated. Yeah. And that way you can always exceed people's expectations of you. And that's true in speeches as well as in just trying to cut a deal.
That's a shame for him because he's very rarely underestimated. The expectations are usually pretty high for him, and I think rightfully so. It's part of the difference you're talking about is. And you're right, it's a completely different situation.
By the way, they do underestimate him. They thought he wasn't going to get a tax bill. They thought he wasn't going to get health care.
I suppose legislatively.
We'll see if he blinks on
not personally,
government shutdowns.
Legislatively, perhaps. Yeah. But part of the difference, I think, the modern presidency is, if not less powerful, and I would argue that it is less powerful, it's powerful in a different way, right? In an entirely different way. And I think it's taken. Not just President Obama, a string of presidents, but he particularly, I think, has come in a moment where it's tough to figure that out. It's taken them a while to figure out where the power of the presidency is. Because the standard model, and it is, I think they do look to Franklin Roosevelt, and they do look to President Kennedy, and they did look to models when they came in, and they did look to Lyndon Johnson. And in all of these cases, what they saw were presidents who were able to sort of twist arms in Congress and make deals and build coalitions, right? All of which, to some extent is probably still possible, but it's very different now because the environment is so much more fractured. Our communications and our politics are so much more fractured. and the politics are so much more responsive because people are polled instantly, because the waves of the country, if everything's nationalized, the media's nationalized, the waves of the country move much more quickly. The internet's changed everything dramatically.
The Cuban Missile Crisis played out against this
right,
media
you wouldn't
environment.
have 13 days to play that out.
No.
Now you'd have 13 hours. So in a sense, it took them a couple of years, I think, to realize that the power comes from going to the people. The power comes from building public support and bringing it to Congress, rather than going to Congress and handing out deals, because the deals aren't there to be made.
This is something that I was thinking about in the earlier panel when they were talking about poetry and power. And to me, President Obama's biggest mistake so far is that he overlearned Mario Cuomo's famous dictum that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And he needed to govern more in poetry. And I think he now gets that, actually. He said this in some recent interviews, that he didn't do what Matt suggested and go out and build enough of a constituency by persuading the public. The head of the Kennedy transition was one of my favorite professors when I was in school, Richard Neustadt, who died a couple of years ago. And he wrote a book called Presidential Power. And the theme of the book can be summarized in one sentence. It was very influential on JFK when it came out in 1960. And the theme of the book was the president really only has one power, and that's the power to persuade. And if he can't persuade, he can't get anything done. And so everything has to flow from those persuasive powers. And Obama focused his too narrowly on, the sausage factory, on putting points on the board, as he likes to say with his sports metaphor, and not going to the country enough. Now, he did do it sometimes, and we forget that he did it, pretty well in a health care speech before Congress, and the Cairo speech holds up very well.
It really has to be sustained.
It has to be sustained
and consistent.
Yeah, and you saw it again in Tucson. He spoke very well. So it's not as if he can't. We know he can persuade. He just didn't use that tool enough.
I was struck listening to Harris Wofford talk about the things that he did persuade on, that Kennedy did persuade on, which were so much, in retrospect, 50 years later, so high-minded. The Peace Corps, or even the to and fro over civil rights, even the fact that those discussions happened about what to do and how far to go, seemed much more honorable than some of the fights we seem to be having now. And part of it is because we view politics so much less honorably than we did then. Am I right about that? That we have come to this place where the idea of Kennedy, one of the reasons we've been able to lionize him, because he came of age at a time when people had high expectations of their government and of their politics, and it's not so much so now?
Well, coming out of World War II, we all felt we were more on the same side. But you could say that we felt that way after 9/11 as well. Look, politics ain't beanbag, as they say, and it never has been, and you can find some pretty rough stuff going on in the 50s and early 60s, not just Joe McCarthy, but plenty of examples of congressmen who were jokers and introduced idiotic bills the way they do today. So some of this, hasn't changed all that much. But I do think that that we were a younger country and maybe a little less jaded, and that we didn't have, because we didn't have cable TV and the internet, we didn't have people yammering at each other all the time. So in the fall of 1963, for instance, President Kennedy gave interviews to Walter Cronkite and I believe David Brinkley on the occasion of them extending the evening news from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. And that was it. Then you had some Sunday shows. You had Meet the Press, a little bit of news on the Today Show, but not really. ABC wasn't a factor yet, much less CNN and the rest of it. So the intensity of it, that yammering all the time, wasn't there, and it did give policymakers more of a chance to kind of catch their breath a little bit. Now, on the missile crisis point, though, something really interesting happened. People say, well, you'd never get 13 days now to make a decision. And Obama was very conscious of that on Afghanistan, and he decided, you know what? not only do I have 13 days, I have more than that.
Well, it's a very different situation.
Yeah, but that was his big, he considered that to be his big foreign policy decision. He said, even though we live in this hurry-up culture, and I've got Dick Cheney telling me with a lot of chutzpah, to stop dithering when they didn't do anything on Afghanistan for 8 years, he had 20 hours of meetings on what to do in Afghanistan, and it was the most deliberative process since the Cuban Missile Crisis on a foreign policy issue.
I thought at the time it was sort of his most Kennedy-esque moment, if you in the sense that he did slow down his generals and slow down the people around him and say, no, I want to, and partly because they'd gotten into where they were, I would argue, by a political rationale. In other words, part of the argument around Afghanistan was, how do we oppose Iraq and not look weak, as we're constantly characterized being weak on foreign policy? Let's do this nice sleight of hand, which is, no, you're fighting the wrong war. It's not that we're just against war. We'd rather be for this war than that war. And then once in office, kind of got a little bit boxed in by that. And so I thought he acted, really prudently and very much as Kennedy did at that time, to sort of step back. Having said that, I don't think it's analogous to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because was not an existential threat. It was not an immediate threat. It was really something he could afford to step back on.
And yet, one of the things that they seem to be most sensitive about in this White House is this idea that he seems like a ditherer, or that he opts for kumbaya over combat.
But he's not sensitive to it. Is the interesting thing. I think maybe there are people in the White House, or the press is always willing to jump on the idea. Here goes Obama. He can't decide. I don't ever get the sense that he is particularly troubled by that. I mean, he's deliberative.
It's not actually accurate. I mean, he is. Kennedy was described as being very decisive. Obama is so much more decisive than Bill Clinton. I have a chapter in my book called "The Un-Bubba," where I try to compare their leadership styles with Clinton and Obama, and you can say a lot critical of Obama, but he is much more like Kennedy in making crisp decisions.
Here's another comparison from a question in the audience. Somebody points out that this is not only the 50th anniversary of the JFK inaugural, but it's also the centenary, the 100th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's birth, and there's been much comparison and discussion about the two of them. But this questioner points out that JFK was saying, let's put a man on the moon, and Reagan was saying government can't solve our problems. One of them was a very forward-thinking government interventionist, and the other one was very much let's pull back. And even Bill Clinton, who you mentioned, talked about the era of big government being over. How similar, really? How different? Was it just different times?
Reagan and Kennedy.
Reagan and Obama.
Reagan and Obama, it's funny. Obama really is, in a sense, you mentioned the effect of Kennedy on that entire generation, which I think is real. And I think the other great influence is Reagan, because he comes in, his political consciousness. What if you're born in 1962? Basically by the time he's 20 years old, when you're in your teens, that Reagan era was really defining for a lot of us who came of age at that time. And I think he absorbed a lot of that. During the primaries, remember in Nevada when he gave an interview and he credited Reagan as the only transformational president.
Yeah, got him in a little bit of trouble.
Got him in a huge amount of trouble. And I think he meant it. I think
he did it intentionally. It was all a scheme on Obama's part.
That is what they said afterwards.
No. This was one of the most brilliant things he did in the entire campaign.
What? What was the point?
It was the incident was this took me a while to piece together because I thought it was a gaffe also.
Yeah.
But it was totally premeditated. He told Marty Nesbitt, his best friend, that he was going to do this. The reason that they did it was they knew that the Clintons would go nuts. They were waving a red flag in front of the Clintons like a,
toreador.
Like a matador, and they wanted them to overreact because they specifically dissed Clinton and praised Reagan, and they knew that they would go crazy and say Obama is like Reagan, and indeed that's exactly the way it played out. And the press jumped to Obama's defense.
What was the point in sticking pins in the Clintons?
Well, what Obama said on the plane to Nevada was, if we stay on the current course, we're going to finish a strong second. We're not going to win. We have to change the dynamic of this race in Nevada, and the only way to do that is to ratchet it up on the Clintons. So anyway,
that's it. It may be the case. I think he meant it regardless.
He did.
I think he believes it. about Reagan. And so I think, not so much a similarity as I would say that Obama, like a lot of people of that generation, absorbed a single argument from Reaganism that I think made a lot of an impression on people at that time, which is that not everything, which is that there had been an excess to the era of liberal government, to the Kennedy, Johnson, even Nixon era, that there had been, that in a sense, some tremendous things had been accomplished, but that you needed, you needed to reevaluate where you were, that some things had gone further or had either outlived their moment or had gone further in the sense of government empowerment than were healthy for the country. And that is an argument that still arouses tremendous passion on the left and gets a lot of people angry and gets taken to an extreme on the right. But I think for a lot of people whose politics were forged in the Reagan era, and I think Obama's was largely, I think it's an overlay, it's a filter that's very hard to dismiss. And I think he comes to politics essentially with the idea that not everything that happened in the liberal era was positive, and not everything that happened in the liberal era remains relevant. And that I think is something he takes directly from having been influenced in that era.
Well, he came to political consciousness in opposition to Ronald Reagan. His first political speech was at Occidental College against apartheid in South Africa. And yet over time he began to realize that, as he said in Nevada, Reagan changed the trajectory of American politics, and that's what he wanted to do.
Tactical rather than ideological is what he's saying. I mean, that's his praise for him was tactical, not his ideology.
Well, yes, it was in the same way that Reagan really respected FDR. He wanted to be kind of an FDR in reverse. I think Obama would like to be a Reagan in reverse, but he was left with such a deficit that he's going to have to, make some Reagan-esque choices. And that's where, see, this is where the arc of American politics gets so fascinating to me. Wisconsin, which is in the news this week, they were the first state to let public employees collectively bargain in 1959. Then in the Kennedy administration, Kennedy extended collective bargaining rights to federal employees. That was the first time they were allowed to collectively bargain. Franklin Roosevelt hadn't believed that federal employees or public employees in general should have those rights. So now here we are, with this big debate 50 years later, and the Peace Corps and the idea behind that is very much on the table again. As Harris Wofford said, the House of Representatives last week zeroed it out, eliminated it entirely from the budget, killed it.
Hey, they zeroed out Corporation for Public Broadcasting either.
They did that too, right? So it's not going to. It's not going to stand. We hope. Gwen and I hope it's not going to stand. But we're going to see how much Obama believes in that Kennedy-esque idea by how hard he fights for it. Will he put it on his do not touch list, or will he allow a 20% cut or 40% cut?
This is when the deal making starts.
Right.
Good question from the audience here. Can health care today be compared to civil rights of the JFK era? Are there similarities and differences in how Obama and JFK handled their respective hot issues?
Well, compare. I mean,
I told you it was good.
I think it's hard to compare as issues health care and civil rights. I personally think they're different. Our argument about health care is to a large extent an argument about how you get to where we like to be as a country.
It wasn't for lack of the Obama administration trying to link it and selling it.
No, I think this is one of my big gripes with their salesmanship on health care was I think health care is a civil rights issue.
And they didn't do that.
And they made a very conscious decision not to pursue it as a right. The way Ted Kennedy always talked about health care as a right. If you are if you get sick and if you have a pre-existing condition, as I do, and you are discriminated against because you've been sick, why is that not another form of discrimination? And yet they refrain,
I wouldn't argue with you. I don't think they would argue with you. My point about the difference in the issues, why it's not, it's not akin to civil rights as you would, is because I think in civil rights there's and in that era generally, in a lot of issues, which is why there is some nostalgia for, I think, that period of government, is there was a lot of moral clarity that could be gained from looking at issues. You were on one side or the other, and for good reason. I think there was a right and there was a wrong, and healthcare, this debate gets mired down in, I mean, I suppose there are people out there who believe, screw it, you shouldn't get healthcare when you're sick. If you didn't save money, that's your problem, or get insurance. But I think by and large, the argument is about how you get there, and it's a very, very complex argument that people find very hard to understand. I find hard to understand, and, having tried very hard about all the various implications of mandates and choice and
which is how it became a
state exchanges and public options. So I think it's a much harder issue to navigate in that sense, and also a less clear issue to navigate.
But do they fail to do it because it's impossible to be morally clear anymore in making an argument for a government program?
I just don't think it's an issue of moral clarity. It's actually an issue of the hows and twos. It's actually an issue of how you navigate the logistics. It's actually a logistical problem to a large extent.
Well, and so is civil rights.
Civil rights. I mean, I think there is a moral clarity on the pre-existing conditions, but even by calling it pre-existing conditions, you're already down into the sheep dip of the lingo and everything. I don't think they wanted.
You are. I mean, you are.
But I don't think they wanted to have that moral clarity on the issue because they thought that the rights revolution is in some ways kind of played out.
And that's an interesting point.
And they, for an African American president to be, talking about rights, and really going there, so they opted for a more nuanced approach, which they also used with ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and it worked.
But
it worked. There's more than one way to skin a cat.
But imagine the great frustration in the African American community, as there was in the gay rights community, about the idea that this transformative breakthrough president should be the one who is cutting corners on language.
This is the nub of it. See, this is where I really side with Obama. He would rather get things done, don't ask, don't tell, eliminated, health care passed, rather than sound good on it and get everybody the warm, fuzzy feeling that he's gone to the barricades and said the right thing. It's a difference between how you view politics. Is it the art of the possible, or is it about getting everybody to, applaud you?
Is there also a political calculation that where are these guys going to go? Really, they got to stick with me?
Well, I mean, there's always that in politics, but again, it's about keeping your eye on. See, I think one of the keys to Barack Obama, and this would apply to John F. Kennedy and his Catholicism. John F. Kennedy didn't want to go down through history as the first Catholic president only, and I don't think Obama wants to go down through history as the first black president only. They want to get things done. When you get there, you don't want to look back. One of Obama's friends told me his great fear was that he would be in his mid-50s, out of office, and look back and say, we could have gotten more done. So he was less interested in giving voice to the people who had backed him and the people he's in sympathy with than in getting things done that can then be built on in later years.
I completely get that, but I've also resonated with me something Roger Wilkins said about how he got his job in the White House earlier, which is someone turned around and said, who knows one? Because they needed it. I'm not so certain it would be so different now.
Well, the White House is you know this from being in there. It's a little bit.
Say it.
Well,
say it. I can't say it.
It's still a pretty white place, but it's not as white as it was in 1961.
Well, woohoo. Let's move on. Sally Bedell Smith was talking earlier about Jackie Kennedy and how she embraced the theatricality of being First Lady. And it sounded very similar to the First Lady we have now. Someone who sat there and studied the impact of what theater she could bring. Michelle Obama knows that the clothes on her back are going to get attention, so she uses it to draw the attention for the things she needs. It's almost like she and Caroline have sat and talked about this. How did your mother manage this? How did she use the attention, the spotlight on her in order to accomplish what I needed to accomplish? Now, in her case, she's trying to accomplish these questions about health issues and fitness issues, and still is getting blowback because there's now a professional, permanent opposition out there to take apart everything that happens in any White House. Do you have a sense that this is all by design, the way Michelle Obama is defining or redefining what it means to be First Lady?
I have no idea. I have no insight into Michelle Obama's operation.
Do you have any insight into Michelle Obama?
She keeps it very close. I think that she...
the Sphinx, I think someone mentioned earlier.
Like Jackie Kennedy, she can have a sharp tongue and a nice, ironic sense of humor about people that she has to keep very much in check in this job, and she's conscious of that.
Another question about Jackie Kennedy. It has been mentioned that Jackie Kennedy was multilingual, and we all think of John Kennedy when we think of foreign relations. What is their lasting legacy on today's politics in terms of fostering strong relationships with other countries? What would our world look like if more politicians were multilingual and skilled cross-culturally? Good question.
You know, one thing that the president does that's kind of interesting that I learned is that before he meets a foreign leader, he memorizes a few phrases in that leader's language, and then he greets him in his language before the interpreters.
You mean personally, one-on-one?
Yeah, before the interpreters take over. And, you know, he learned some Indonesian language when he was a young man, and I think he is very much sees himself as a not just representing the United States, but as a citizen of the world, and definitely has that international perspective that the Kennedys did. And you can see when Michelle Obama travels, it reminds me a little bit of when JFK went to Europe and introduced himself as, I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. And Michelle Obama can have that effect on some of these foreign trips. And in that sense, I don't think there's been anybody in between, even Hillary Clinton, who had quite as galvanizing an effect when they traveled.
Although it shows you how different the political moment is today. If you had a president or first lady who spoke French, it would be, you'd take a hit in the polls. John Kerry had to prove that he didn't know French, right? I remember talking to John Kerry in the election in 2004 and having this, seize this moment of discomfort that to show me that he wasn't drinking Evian. And it's a very, I don't think that reflects well on where our politics have traveled in 50 years.
Another big part of the legacy of JFK, obviously, is public service. And we have a president who very famously was a community organizer and came up, and we heard the story, made a choice to go back to Chicago instead of going on to a law firm or a Supreme Court clerkship. So how much of that is a carryover or a continuation or faithfulness to the kind of commitment to public service that John F. Kennedy is so...
I think this is what President Obama actually is going to face, and faces a significant choice and dilemma. I think this is an important aspect of his moment because he is faced with this, with a significant budget situation. This is not nothing, no matter what you believe. This is his own... Debt Commission has laid out a very stark scenario. They're not the first ones to do it. This is going to be an argument, as it is today, over how you retrench, reinvent government, to a sense. That argument isn't going away. And I think he very much wants to have it. I mean, my sense of talking to people in the White House is he's sincere about this. He was saying, I want to do entitlement reform. I wanted, he wanted to do this stuff, again, like health care, even if it takes a hit. There are things he wants to get done as president, and I think this is high on the list. But I do think that we're reaching a moment now where somebody, and that somebody ought to be the president, probably needs to stand up and remind people of the nobility of government service and public service in general, that there is an assault now on government that extends into the idea of service. And I think as President Kennedy made public service such a noble aspiration for a generation of Americans, I think this president is going to have an opportunity and maybe an imperative to remind a generation of Americans and several, that whatever you think, whatever conversation you want to have about what government ought to do and what its role is and how large it ought to be, that there is a necessity and a nobility in public service that is endemic to the American idea.
Is it nobility because people just don't want to spend government federal money, tax money, and therefore they think public service is a good way of getting the work done for free?
Is that what makes it noble?
Yeah. Is that this is the way people see public service now instead of seeing it as good?
No, I think what they're seeing is incredible. What I just saw after spending a month with Governor Christie in New Jersey. I've got a cover coming out this week. That's a small plug, by the way. And but what you see playing out in Wisconsin right now, in all seriousness,
right.
I mean, it's nothing that high-minded. The attack here is if we can make government bureaucrats. This goes back to the Reagan era. If you can make bureaucrats, if you can make people serving in government out to be, in a sense, the enemy of progress and austerity and discipline and common sense, then you can mount a very strong argument for scaling back government, because every issue needs an adversary. Every assault needs a public face. And I think there's a balance here, because I don't think President Obama believes, nor should he, that this is all cynical and that all criticism of government is unwarranted. But I think you do have to balance that in a sense with the more Kennedy-esque ideal that with the responsibility to reevaluate government comes a responsibility to remind people that what ordinary Americans do in government is extraordinary and necessary for the country.
He started to say that last week, but I think you put your finger on what is going to be his biggest challenge, because Kennedy could do that coming out of World War II, where we had saved the world through public service, military service, so many people working for the government spending at 115% of GDP during World War II. Now we're coming out of a period where if you look at public employees at the state level, and I think Obama understood this, there is as noble a calling as public service is, there is a substantive case that the public employees unions went too far. And so Obama tried to introduce accountability into the debate over education. And on health care, in the final days of the negotiations, he was trying to get labor to make some givebacks, because public employees contribute such a small percentage to their health insurance.
And are a growing and growing
but what
segment
is
of the workforce.
So the idea of going to the barricades to defend public employees who are contributing much less to their own health insurance than those in the private sector, it's a very hard argument for him to make.
But what is the distinction? But he's not doing it in a vacuum. He's also, when he's trying to prove his fealty to budget discipline, one of the first things he talked about was freezing pay increases for federal employees.
Right.
And we heard John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, say last week, well, if you got to lose some jobs in the federal sector, so be it. He walked that back. But what's the difference between, I mean, those are the kinds of small things which send a signal to people that public service or public employment is not as prized as it once was.
Well, a pay freeze, I mean, it's a gimmick.
Small, but I'm not
It's a gimmick, but
yeah.
he has to try to get out politically, he has to get out in front of this, because there are going to be some significant cuts. There's a huge difference between cutting, $100 billion, as the Republicans want to do, and cutting a few billion. Neither of them are, as David Walker, who's the former head of the GAO, the former Comptroller General, told me last week, they're arguing about the bar bill on the Titanic. Neither of them is really focused on the big cost drivers in the system.
Well,
but in terms of JFK, I think that he would have also approached it in a pragmatic way to try to get to some kind of common sense, pragmatic, non-ideological solutions. But they become really hard when you have one political party in particular, and I don't think this is a partisan comment, but a statement of fact, that is significantly more ideological than the other political party. And so you have a mismatch in terms of, trying to deal with these issues of the role of government, because you have one party that wants to, say, wreck the unions, whereas the other party, the president, is going to speak to the Chamber of Commerce to try to mend fences with them. So in the order of battle, in American politics, you're getting a kind of an uneven thing where one side wants to take the other side out. If they could take these unions out at the state level, they'll have the run of the place.
Yeah.
Corporate power will have the run of state capitals, whereas the Democrats aren't trying to take corporations out.
There's too much nuance. There is more nuance, you think, on that side?
There's much more nuance. They want to work with both business and labor. Republicans want to smash labor. Big difference. Don't mistake what's going on in Wisconsin. They had a surplus. They just cut taxes by $117 million. If they had had such a crisis, they never would have done that. This is an effort to try to destroy the public employees unions.
And in that sense, by the way, it's very different from what's happening in New Jersey. I mean, they're very different situations.
In this environment, and we'll end on this, we'll try to be a little uplifting. Not much. In this environment, we come at a time to take note of the 50th anniversary of a president who is known, if nothing else, but for his optimism and his uplift and the idea of what we could achieve together if we all contributed. And he talked a lot about taking man to the moon and other things which talked about as aspiration. And we have a president who tries to talk about aspiration as well. He talks about innovation, and he talks about ways of building on what we have, and ways of seizing control of our education system, for instance, race to the top, an aspirational idea.
We're going to win the future.
We're going to win, we hate that. We're going to win the future. But that said, we're in a very different environment than we were before. The government in 1960 wasn't considered to be an innately bad thing, and spending government money to have an outcome was not an innately bad thing. How much more of a challenge is it for Barack Obama to be uplifting than it was for Kennedy?
It's it is a challenge in this environment. Everybody, I think, would agree that it's a greater challenge. But I don't underestimate. I'm probably in a small minority in this room. I don't underestimate the importance and the power of what he just did in his State of the Union address and then in his budget, because the left screams that he wants to, he's going to cut spending and they're going to compete to see who can cut back government. But what the president really did in both of those instances, I think, is to say for the first time in his presidency, we need to prioritize. We do need to make some difficult choices, but there's also an important argument to be made for long-term public investment. It's going to cost us a lot of money, and we have to do it. And he is the first president to make that argument in decades. That is the most progressive argument, in a sense, a president has made, this sort of full-throated support for public infrastructure money and public investment in competitiveness that any president has made in a very long time, certainly in my lifetime.
But we've established you're not very old.
Right. That's right. I love and follically challenged, which is hard to square the two. But I think this is a very important moment for him. I think this State of the Union and this budget are much bolder in a sense than they're being portrayed. Everybody says, he wants everything and it's not very bold, and he wants to cut only a little bit and not a lot. He wants to spend a little bit and not a lot. I don't think so. I think he's actually put down a marker that he's going to spend these next 2 years, and if he gets more, another 4 years, trying to reevaluate and modernize government, but also making a very strong case for public investments that are, I think, and he thinks, are critical to the country going forward 20 and 30 years.
I agree.
I think that is uplifting.
I agree with that, Matt. I totally agree with that. But here's the problem that he faces. When Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon, there was a huge competition. Who's going to get the Space Center? And the vice president got it, right? It went to Texas.
Right.
So people wanted, but in those days, people wanted to bring projects back to their states. They saw government spending as a way for them to employ their people and, create economic development. This governor in Wisconsin, he actually got elected by rejecting the high-speed rail money. He said, no, we don't want a train between Madison in Milwaukee. So there's been, and the whole, reaction to earmarks, which are a tiny percentage of the budget, but they're indicative
but you
of
don't
people
win an
sort of-
argument like that the day after the speech, or the month after the speech, or 2 months after the speech, or during the term of one governor or another. You win that argument over a sustained period of time, and no one has made that sustained case to the American people for decades.
Not a better conversation. Sorry.
No, I'm done.
Not a better conversation going on anywhere until the news era tonight. John Alter and Matt Bai.
Thank you.
Once again, a number of books are on sale, including Gwen Ifill's and Jonathan Alter's, and Ellen Fitzpatrick will take orders for her voluminous tome on the teaching of American history. I want to thank you all again for coming, and I especially want to thank all of our panel for this extraordinary afternoon.